In the workshop, a Stuart 504 boiler, part 9, making a simple baseboard using some scrap pieces of wood. In the last episode, I completed the gas burner mounting and heatsink, and now I need to mount the entire assembly on a piece of wood. At this point of the job, I couldn't find my tape measure, so I just used 2 rulers instead. When I was building the workshop, I bought some pieces of plywood for shelves, and I had some bits left over. This is terrible plywood. The reason for this episode being about making a baseboard from a scrap piece of wood is really because of the current situation. Wandering around a DIY store looking for a piece of wood for a baseboard is not a smart idea. I'm cutting this piece of plywood on my metal cutting bandsaw, which is not ideal, I must admit. I do have a handheld circular saw, but that makes a mess. Eventually this fine metal cutting blade on the bandsaw gets through the wood, but it's a bit uneven. I used a set square to just check how uneven it was, and it wasn't as bad as I thought. It's over to the belt sander to find that the belt sander's belt once again has broken. The belt sander I use is a Sealy belt sander, and it's absolutely useless. I contacted Sealy to buy a new one, but beyond belief they didn't have any. So I bought a couple of belts via eBay, and this is the size you need if you have the same model Sealy belt sander as I do. I fitted the belt and I cleaned up the piece of plywood. I did consider fitting this small pump to the boiler. This would pump water into the boiler to keep the level constant, but after I ran my Stuart triple expansion engine using the 504 boiler, I thought that a pump like this would not really be necessary, because the hand pump that are connected to this boiler has a large ram and pumps in plenty of water at every stroke. Here's how I fitted the boiler to the baseboard. First of all, I placed it on the baseboard and measured it to make sure it was in the middle. Then I marked the position of the boiler mountings using this special marking pen. It's a felt tip pen with a very long point, a very useful item indeed. Now I have 4 marks on the baseboard, and when I remove the boiler, then all I need to do, as you can see here, is place the burner heatsink in place, reposition the boiler, and by aligning the marks that are made on the baseboard with the boiler mounting lugs, the burner heatsink is moved into the correct position. I remove the boiler very carefully, not wishing to disturb the position of the heatsink. Then once again, using the special felt tip marker pen, I mark the position of the heatsink through the holes, being very careful not to move it out of alignment. Here I'm drilling some pilot holes into the baseboard, using this excellent Proxon motor tool. Watching the video, it did occur to me that I should have removed the heatsink and drilled the holes in the positions that I'd marked, but this seems to work just fine. Originally I countersunk the holes on the heatsink, and I was going to use some countersunk screws, but then I found a few of these stainless steel screws left over from when I built the railway at the other house, so it seemed like a sensible idea to use them. As they are slot-headed stainless steel screws, I was very careful not to slip with the screwdriver. Once I'd mounted the burner heatsink in place, I drilled some 1/8 of an inch diameter holes on the marks I'd made for the boiler mounting, and I threaded these holes 4BA. I didn't have any 4BA countersunk bolts long enough to come all the way through the baseboard, so I needed to counter drill it from underneath, and to make sure that the counter drillings were all the same depth, I fitted a small piece of silicone rubber tubing to the twist drill. This forms a quick and simple depth stop. Although it doesn't really stop the drill. If I push the drill hard, it will go all the way through. But the solution is simple. Just stop pushing the drill when the silicone rubber touches the wood. Now I can screw the 4BA countersunk bolts in from underneath. And now, thanks to the fact that the holes are threaded 4BA, the brass bolts stay in place once they're screwed in and stick out of the top of the baseboard the same amount. No sooner had I done that though, I unscrewed them, because there's still some more work to do on the piece of wood itself. I'm only going to use the Stuart 504 boiler on the workbench to quickly test steam engines, because 504 boilers hold a lot of water for their size, so I can't live with it just being screwed to this rough piece of plywood. When I was putting up the shelves in the workshop, I bought a lot of this stuff. It's just soft wood in a sort of half-round section. And in this clip, I've cut a couple of pieces to the right length to fit across the ends of the wood. I've applied some wood glue, and now I'm going to tack them in place with some panel pins. the video clip is running at a high speed, which is just as well because the only panel pins I could find in the workshop were very long ones. I put 2 pins in each end. So this, in conjunction with the PVA glue, should make these pieces of trim a very permanent fixture. I repeated the process along the top and bottom edges, using 2 longer pieces of wood. Now it's over to the belt sander, and thankfully the belt hasn't broken yet. First of all, I'm sanding away the underneath because these pieces of trim were a bit too wide for the thickness of the plywood. I'm in the outer part of the workshop by a wide open door, but you should really wear breathing apparatus when you're doing a job like this, at least a breathing mask. I've got about half a dozen breathing masks that I've had for years. Please note I didn't go out panic buying breathing masks. But I recommend you wear breathing masks when you're doing jobs like this because there's a lot of wooden particles floating about. After I cleaned up the thickness of the wooden beading, I rounded the edges using my 1-inch belt sander. This Sealy product seems to be okay, quite unlike the 4-inch belt sander from the same maker. The rest of the job is handwork, using first of all some emery cloth, followed by some wet to dry sandpaper. And now it looks like this. It's a very low quality piece of plywood though, and the edges are quite raggy, so what I'm going to do is mix up some car body filler, and I'm using the baseboard to mix it on. Well, why not? You will also notice I've added far too much hardener. I didn't do this on purpose, but now I am aware I don't have long to apply the filler to the work before it sets hard. I don't normally do jobs like this, but because this boiler is just for the workshop, and besides, as I mentioned earlier, I really don't fancy wandering around a DIY store at this time, that's the only reason I'm making the baseboard in this way. Normally, if I make my own baseboard for a model like a steam plant or something, I always use top quality birch plywood. It's more expensive, but it's a lot better. In no time at all, the filler set hard, so now it's just a simple job to rub the excess off, first of all as before, using some emery cloth, followed by some wet to dry sandpaper. This gives quite a smooth finish, surprisingly. Once I was more or less happy with the finish, I took the baseboard into the outer part of the workshop, placed it upside down on my painting jig, because don't forget, with an engine baseboard you need to seal it underneath as well as on the top, because when the boiler's in use there could be quite a lot of water in close proximity to the underside of the baseboard. Please note this is not etch primer that I'm using, it's ordinary grey primer. I bought a pack of these a while back from a DIY store. The paint is called High Coat, and it seems to be fine. Once I've painted the underside, I turned over the baseboard to paint the top side. I'm applying quite a thick coat because most of it has been soaked into the wood. And tomorrow, when this coat is thoroughly dry, I will rub it down and apply another coat of the primer, followed by a couple of top coats, and the baseboard should look okay for the job I want it to do. I'll leave you with a gratuitous shot of the paint drying as usual, and that's it for this episode. Stay safe, stay well, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website. Click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you will find it very easy to find other videos that you may like to watch.